There are houses that hold their secrets the way the earth holds its dead. Pressed down, buried deep under years of weight, silent for generations. And then, one day, the floor gives way. Not always in some dramatic, movie-like collapse. Sometimes, it's the slow groan of old wood settling in the cold. Sometimes, it's a hollow sound beneath your heel where there shouldn't be one. And sometimes, it's nothing more than a crack of light where no light should exist. Just a thin, pale line running along the grain of the floorboards, like a scar that never quite healed. That's exactly how it began in the Harwick house. Not with thunder, not with screams, not with fire. Just a crack of light. And what was lying beneath that light? Under the dining room floor, where a family had shared their meals for decades, where children grew up and elders passed away, where prayers were said and wine was poured, and ordinary life just carried on without a single hint of suspicion, was not at all what anyone could have imagined. What was down there rewrote everything. Every meal, every prayer, every story the Harwick family had ever told themselves about who they were. Now, this isn't some legend. This isn't folklore passed down through whispers and tall tales. This is a fully documented account, pieced together from coroner's reports, county court documents, the personal diary of a woman who found out the truth far too late, and the testimony of a man who spent his final years making sure the world would never forget what happened in that house in Harlan County, Kentucky, back in 1887. So, you need to pay attention, because every single detail matters. And trust me, the details in this story are truly extraordinary. Welcome to the Fear Sermon. Harlan County sits in the southeastern corner of Kentucky, pressed right up against the Virginia border by the ridges of the Cumberland Mountains. These mountains rise southwest steep and so close together that the valleys between them only get a few hours of direct sunlight each day, even in the middle of summer. It's the kind of land that really imposes itself on the people living there. Heavy, close, watchful. The mountains don't shelter you, they observe you. The town of Loyal, which wouldn't officially become a town until 1912, was back in 1887 little more than a small collection of buildings scattered with no real plan along Martin's Fork Creek. You had a general store, a Methodist church, a grain mill, a blacksmith, and maybe 40 households all within reasonable walking distance of each other. The railroad hadn't shown up yet. The coal companies hadn't arrived either, though they were coming. Within 10 years, they'd transform Harlan County completely, stripping away the solitude, flooding the valleys with workers and machinery and pure ambition. But in 1887, none of that had happened. The county was quiet in that special way places get when they've been largely left alone for a very long time. The Harwick property sat on a low ridge about 1.5 miles north of the Loyal settlement. You could get to it by a rutted wagon track that followed the creek most of the way before climbing a short embankment and flattening out into a wide, uneven yard. The house itself was pretty substantial by local standards. 2 stories of hewn timber with a stone foundation, a covered front porch, a separate kitchen building connected by a covered walkway, a root cellar dug into the hillside about 20 yards from the back door, and several outbuildings in various states of repair. It had been built in 2 stages. The original one-room structure dated back to the 1830s, while the larger addition, which included the dining room, was finished in the 1850s, according to a deed recorded in Harlan County in 1856. The property had gone through 3 owners before the Harwicks got there. The first was a man named Dunbar, who built the original place and farmed a modest piece of land along the creek bottom. He sold it in 1841 to a family named Slagle, who added the outbuildings and the kitchen walkway. The Slagles held onto it for 15 years before selling it to a man named Cord Harwick in the spring of 1856. Cord Harwick was 41 when he bought the property. He'd come to Harlan County from Letcher County, where he briefly ran a small tannery before a disagreement with a business partner. The details were never made public, though it caused enough local gossip that he apparently decided a fresh start in a neighboring county was smarter than sticking around in Whitesburg. He showed up in Harlan County with a wagon, a wife named Eleanor, 3 kids between the ages of 6 and 12, and a reputation that was neither good nor bad. It was just absent. In a place where most men carried the weight of well-known families and established histories, that gave him a strange, undefined quality. He was a man from somewhere else, a man without a county story. Eleanor Harwick, by most accounts, was a capable woman. Organized, plain-spoken, not overly social, but not unfriendly either. She ran a household with that quiet efficiency people usually only notice when it stops. She kept a kitchen garden and preserved her own vegetables. She attended the Methodist church regularly, though without any particular passion. She had opinions she expressed without apology, and if neighbors sometimes described her as reserved, it seemed like a deliberate choice rather than her natural personality. She was watching something, always watching. Their children, 2 sons and a daughter, were Walter, age 12, Daniel, age 9, and Nora, age 6, when they moved to the Harlan property. By 1887, 31 years later, Walter was 43, married with his own kids, and living 2 counties away in Bell County. Daniel had died of fever back in 1872 at just 24 years old. Nora, now Nora Harwick Pruitt, married to a man named George Pruitt, was 37 and living 6 miles from the family place. Cord Harwick had died in the winter of 1881, leaving Eleanor widowed and alone in that house on the ridge. He was 66. The official cause of death, according to the county physician who attended him, was congestion of the lungs. Eleanor buried him in the small family plot at the edge of the property, had a stone carved by a man in Loyal, and just kept living in the house. She was 72 in the spring of 1887. She'd lived there for 31 years, and never once, in all those years, had she suspected that the floor of her dining room wasn't what it seemed. It all started on a morning in March. Eleanor had risen early, like she always did. The habit of a farm woman, up before the light was fully decided, moving through the house with the comfortable ease of someone who knows every board and corner by heart. She'd made her fire in the kitchen stove, put the water on to heat, and walked through the covered passage to the dining room to grab a small crock of dried beans she'd left on the sideboard the night before. She was crossing the floor when she heard it. A hollow sound, not quite a knock, not quite an echo, but something in between, coming from under her right foot with every step she took across a certain spot near the center of the room. She stopped, took a step back, then stepped on it again. The sound came back, unmistakable this time. A faint but definite hollowness that didn't match the solid, close-grained sound the rest of the floor made. She stood on that spot for a long moment, pressing her weight down, listening. It wasn't the sound of a settling foundation. Eleanor had lived in old houses long enough to know what settling sounded like. This was different. This was the sound of empty space under pressure. The sound of something hollow because it was built to be hollow, not because it had decayed or shifted. She got down on her hands and knees. The floorboards in the dining room were wide-cut oak planks, dark with age and years of cleaning, fitted so tightly together that in most places you couldn't slide a knife blade between them. But when Eleanor bent close to that spot, she noticed something she'd never noticed before. And she'd say later she couldn't understand how she'd missed it, because once seen, it seemed totally obvious. The grain pattern of the boards in that central section wasn't continuous with the grain of the boards on either side. They were the same wood, same width, same color, stained by decades of the same cleaning cloths and oil and kitchen smoke. But the grain ran differently. In the boards around it, the grain curved and stretched in those long flowing arcs of planks cut from old-growth timber, full of character and variation. In the central section, about 4 feet by 3 feet, she'd later estimate, the grain was straighter, tighter, more uniform. Like boards cut from a different tree, or boards cut for a different purpose and placed here to match as closely as possible what surrounded them. She pressed her fingers along the edges of that section. The gap between the central boards and the surrounding floor was so fine it was almost invisible. But it was there. A hairline separation running all the way around on all 4 sides. A door. Eleanor Harwick was kneeling on the floor of her dining room in a house she'd lived in for 31 years, looking at a door built right into the floor that she'd never known existed. She sat back on her heels for a very long time. Then she stood up, walked out of the room, walked out of the house, and walked the 6 miles to her daughter's home, not saying a single word about what she'd found until she got there. George Pruitt was a practical man. A builder by trade, competent and methodical, not given to flights of imagination or dramatic interpretations of ordinary events. He was 39 in 1887. 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, with the careful hands of a man who worked with timber and knew exactly what it could do. He'd been married to Nora for 14 years. He liked his mother-in-law. He thought she was sensible, and he trusted her judgment. So when Eleanor showed up at their door and told him she'd found something unusual under the dining room floor, George didn't ask many questions. He just put on his coat. They arrived at the Harwick house in the early afternoon, George and Nora together. George carried his tool bag, brought along out of professional habit. If there was a floor panel that needed lifting, he'd need the right tools to do it without damaging the surrounding boards. In the dining room, Eleanor showed him the section. George got on his knees, ran his hands over it just like she had, pressed down, listened to the hollow sound come back. Then he took a thin-bladed tool from his bag, worked it carefully along the edge of the section, and confirmed what Eleanor had already found. The separation was clean and precise. This wasn't a gap from shrinkage or poor joinery. It was a manufactured joint, built to hold close. He worked methodically, clearing the gap on all 4 sides, feeling with his fingers for any locking mechanism, any peg or pin holding it in place. Nothing on the north side, nothing on the east. But on the south, near the center of that edge, his finger pressed against something that gave way. A small recessed tab built into the underside of the panel, invisible from above unless you were probing for it. He pressed it. The panel shifted. Not much, maybe a 1/4 inch, but enough to break the seal. George looked up at Nora and Eleanor. Neither of them spoke. He gripped the edge of the panel with both hands and lifted. The panel was hinged on the north side. A pair of heavy iron hinges recessed so deeply into the wood they'd been completely invisible from above. It swung up and over, settling against the floor with a slow, controlled movement that told George right away this was expert craftsmanship. The hinges were designed to hold the weight without sagging, to swing cleanly without binding, and to let it rest open without falling back. Underneath the panel was a framed opening, maybe 3 feet by 2.5, with the framing mortised into the surrounding floor structure so solidly it would have held the full weight of a table and chairs placed directly on top without any flex at all. And below that opening, dropping away into darkness, was a staircase. Cut stone steps, narrow and steep, descending at a sharp angle into absolute blackness. The 3 of them knelt at the edge and looked down. The air coming up from below was cold and still, carrying a faint, complex smell none of them could immediately place. Old earth, definitely. And stone. And something else. Something that didn't fit any familiar category. Something that settled at the back of your throat and just stayed there. How far does it go? Nora asked. George got a candle from the kitchen. He held it at the opening and watched the flame. It bent slightly. There was a draft from below, barely noticeable, which meant the space at the bottom connected to outside air somewhere. He counted the steps visible in the candle's light. 7. Then darkness. He looked at Eleanor. Did your husband ever mention anything about this? Eleanor's expression wasn't what either of them expected. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't confusion. It was something harder to read. She was looking at that opening in her floor with an expression George Pruitt would later describe in his testimony before the Harlan County Court as recognition without understanding. No, she said quietly. He never mentioned it. Then after a moment, she said something else, something George would repeat many times over the following weeks, and that would become one of the most quoted lines in the county records related to this case. But I think I know what it is. To really understand what Eleanor believed she'd found, and why she believed it, you need to step back from that house on the ridge and look at the bigger landscape around it. Harlan County, Kentucky, sits in a pretty unique geographic and historical spot. Surrounded by mountains that made large-scale plantation farming impossible, the county never developed the kind of slave economy that defined the bluegrass region and much of central and western Kentucky. Farms here were small and self-sufficient. Slavery, where it existed, was limited. The 1850 census recorded fewer than 120 enslaved people in the whole county, spread across maybe 20 households, most holding 2 or 3 individuals, not the dozens or hundreds you'd see in the plantation counties to the north and west. but that didn't mean Harlan County was without conflict over slavery. Being so close to Virginia, the state line ran barely 15 miles east of Loyal, created a particular set of tensions, different from the plantation regions but just as significant. The mountains that isolated Harlan County from the broader currents of state and national life also created a corridor. The ridgelines and creek valleys of the Cumberland Mountains had long been traveled by people moving without permission. People who decided, at enormous personal risk, that the life they'd been assigned wasn't the one they'd accept. The route through Harlan County wasn't one of the formally documented pathways of the Underground Railroad. Those more organized networks tended to run through the central and western parts of the state, through Louisville and Lexington and the river crossings to the north. What passed through the southeastern mountains was something more informal, more improvised, more dependent on individual human decisions made in darkness and silence. People in these mountains helped runaways not because they belonged to any organization, not because they got instructions or payment, but because when a person showed up at their door in the night, hungry and scared, some people opened that door and some people didn't. The Harwick house sat on a ridge with long views in 3 directions. It was 1.5 miles from the nearest settlement. It had a root cellar and multiple outbuildings. It sat along a route that, if you were traveling north through the mountains on foot, would be a reasonable place to stop. What Eleanor had suspected for a very long time, and what she'd never asked Cord directly, and what Cord had never told her, was that the men she'd married had been, at some point before their life together in Harlan County, involved in something he had reason to hide. Not exactly a criminal matter, not the kind of thing that leaves ordinary records, but a buried history. She'd pieced it together over 30 years from things that had no business fitting together as neatly as they did. A conversation she'd overheard in the summer of 1858, when a man she didn't recognize showed up after dark and left before dawn, and the look on Cord's face as he watched him go. A passage in Cord's personal journal, which she'd found after his death, that mentioned arrangements, and the lower passage, in terms too vague to be clearly interpreted, but too specific to be completely dismissed. The behavior of their dog, a big mixed hound named Barker, who'd spent several nights in the late 1850s and early 1860s stationed at the north end of the dining room with an alertness she'd blamed at the time on something burrowing under the house. She'd suspected something was there. She just hadn't known its form. And now she did. George Pruitt went down the stairs first with a lantern. He went slowly, placing his feet carefully on the cut stone steps, testing each one before putting his full weight down. The stairs were solid. The stone was dry and stable, the edges still sharp, showing no real wear. Someone had cut and laid them carefully, and whoever did it knew what they were doing. There were 11 steps total. George counted as he descended. At the bottom, the lantern light spread into a low-ceilinged chamber cut directly into the earth and stone of the ridge. The walls were shored with timber, old timber, dark with age, fitted against the stone with wooden wedges driven into the gaps to prevent collapse. The floor was bare earth, packed hard and smooth. The ceiling, supported by the same timber framework lining the walls, was roughly 6 feet at its highest point, dropping slightly toward the back of the space. The chamber was about 12 feet long and 8 feet wide. And it wasn't empty. Against the far wall, arranged with a care that was immediately obvious even to someone who didn't yet understand what they were looking at, were several objects. A wooden pallet raised off the earth floor on 2 low runners, the kind of simple sleeping platform you could build in an afternoon from rough lumber. An iron hook set into the wall, from which hung 2 folded wool blankets that had aged to the color of old tea. On the floor under the hook, a tin cup and a tin plate, their surfaces evenly oxidized. A wooden box, low and flat, about the size of a small trunk, sitting against the east wall with its lid closed. And in the corner nearest the stairs, pressed into the angle where the east wall met the south wall, as if placed there by someone who'd thought carefully about where it would be most useful, a small iron stove, not more than 2 feet high, with a pipe rising into the ceiling and disappearing. Not through the floor of the dining room above, as George had half expected, but through the stone of the ridge wall itself, exiting, as George would determine after a later examination, at a point roughly 15 feet east of the house, where the chimney outlet was hidden behind a dense thicket of rhododendron that had grown against the hillside over many years. George stood in the middle of that chamber and turned slowly, holding the lantern, and he understood exactly what he was looking at. This was a room built for people to live in. Built with intention and care, designed for concealment, equipped for long-term stays. The stove vented sideways through the mountain instead of upward to keep smoke from appearing above the house. The staircase was hidden under a floor panel made to be invisible. The chamber itself was cut deep enough into the ridge that no sound from inside would reach the surface. Someone had built this room so people could live in it without anyone above or outside ever knowing they were there. He climbed back up the stairs. Nora and Eleanor were sitting at the dining room table. Neither had spoken since he went down. "There's a room," he said. "A proper room with a sleeping platform and a stove. The stove vents through the hill." Nora looked at her mother. Eleanor was staring at the open panel in the floor. "How old is it?" Nora asked. "The timber's very old," George said. "The stove is cast iron. Could be 20, 30 years old. Could be older." He paused. "There are blankets still there." Eleanor said nothing. George sat down. He put the lantern on the table. He looked at his mother-in-law for a long time. "Mrs. Harwick," he said, "what do you know about this room?" Eleanor looked up. Her eyes were clear and direct, the way they always were. But underneath that clarity, there was something else. A tiredness, maybe, or a weight that had been carried for a very long time and was only now being set down. "I know it was there before we arrived," she said. "The room was there when Cord bought this house. The Slagles built it, or had it built, sometime in the 1840s. She paused. "I believe it was used for what you think it was used for. And I believe it was used after we arrived as well, though Cord never said so to me directly." Nora stared at her mother. "Why didn't you ever ask him?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Because there are things you don't put into words. Things that are safer as silence. I knew what the room was in the way you know things you haven't been told. And I knew that knowing it directly, having it spoken, having it become a conversation, would put us all in danger." She folded her hands on the table. "Those were different times. You were children." George went back down. He needed to know what was in that box. Nora followed him this time, despite his mild objection. She descended carefully, holding the wall, and stood beside him in the low chamber while he crouched before the wooden box against the east wall. It wasn't locked. The lid was held by two simple iron clasps that had rusted to the color of dried blood, and George opened them with some effort, the metal stiff and reluctant after years of cold and damp. Inside was a collection of objects arranged with obvious care, not thrown in, not scattered, but placed as if someone had considered each item and chosen its position deliberately. On top lay a piece of folded oilcloth, which George lifted and set aside. Under it was a thin leather-bound book, roughly the size of a man's palm, its cover worn smooth at the edges and the leather cracked along the spine. George opened it carefully. The pages were handwritten, the ink faded to a pale brown, the handwriting variable, sometimes neat and deliberate, sometimes cramped and rushed, as if written under different conditions at different times. It was a record of some kind. Dates, initials, directions, numbers that might have been distances, names of geographical features, creeks, ridges, the occasional settlement name, and at intervals what looked like simple shorthand notations, pairs of initials, sometimes a single word, sometimes nothing but a small mark that could have been a tick or a cross. George couldn't decipher most of it. Not because the writing was illegible, but because whatever system the writer had used wasn't self-explanatory. It hadn't been written for any future reader. It was a private aid to memory, intelligible only to someone who already knew what the entries referred to. Under the book was a small collection of folded papers, various kinds of documents. George opened each one carefully. The first was a torn half-sheet of paper with a rough map drawn on it, showing a trail through what looked like mountain terrain with compass directions marked and 2 or 3 landmarks noted in handwriting that didn't match the journal. The map had been handled many times. The fold lines were deep and soft, the edges worn. The second was a fragment of a letter, the top half missing, beginning mid-sentence, and if you find yourself unable to proceed before the weather turns, the lower room will hold 2 comfortably for as long as required. The stove can be vented without showing. You will find everything necessary. God keep you safe. There was no signature. The paper was water-stained and brittle. The handwriting was that of an educated person, the letters formed carefully, the language chosen with deliberation. The third document was the one that stopped both George and Nora cold. It was a complete letter on better quality paper than the others, dated April 14, 1857, addressed to no named individual, but beginning with the salutation, "To whoever uses this place after me." The handwriting was precise and unhurried, the ink darker than the other documents, suggesting it had been written more recently than the rest. George read it aloud, slowly in the lantern light. "To whoever uses this place after me, I do not know your name, and you do not know mine. That is as it should be. The less we know of one another, the safer we are. But I have found myself unable to leave this place without writing something, without leaving some record that this room existed and what it was used for. Even if that record is never read by anyone who was not already present here. This room was built in the year 1847 by a man whose name I will not write. He built it for the purpose you understand. In the years between its building and the present writing, it has been used 7 times to my knowledge. The number of persons who have passed through it is 17. I have confirmed 9 safe arrivals. Of the other 8, I have no certain knowledge. I am writing this because I am leaving this county. The circumstances of my departure are such that I do not expect to return. The house above has been sold. I do not know the new owner or his sympathies. I have taken what I could carry. I leave the room as it is, with the hope that whoever comes after will understand its purpose and choose accordingly. I leave only one instruction. There is a second room. I will not describe where it is. If you have need of it, you will find it. If you do not have need of it, it is better that you do not know. May God grant mercy to everyone who has ever sheltered in this darkness, and to everyone who made the choice to keep the light on for them." The letter ended there. George folded it and held it for a long moment without speaking. "A second room," Nora said. George nodded. They looked at each other in the lantern light in that low stone chamber under the dining room floor, and neither said what both were thinking. The discovery was reported to the Harlan County Sheriff 3 days after George found the panel in the floor. The delay was deliberate. Eleanor had asked for time, and George and Nora had granted it without fully explaining why. There was an instinct at work that none of them could easily name, a sense that the room and its contents belonged to a category of history that wasn't entirely theirs to expose, that whatever decision they made about that staircase carried a weight that deserved some thought. By 1887, slavery had been abolished for 22 years. The Civil War had been over just as long. The Underground Railroad, to the extent it had ever been publicly acknowledged, was by then becoming the subject of memoirs and tributes rather than criminal investigations. The legal danger of having housed runaway slaves hadn't existed for a generation. But the personal histories involved were another matter. The previous owner of the house, the man who'd sold it to Court Harwick in 1856, was named Rufus Slagle. Rufus Slagle was dead. His son, a man named Clarence Slagle, was not. He was 61 years old and lived 4 miles from Loyal. He was by all accounts a prominent and well-regarded member of the county. He'd served 2 terms on the county court. His family was known and respected. The letter in the box had said, "This room was built in the year 1847 by a man whose name I will not write." It had said, "The house above has been sold. I do not know the new owner or his sympathies." It hadn't named Rufus Slagle, but the timeline was exact. The room was built in 1847 when the Slagles owned the property. The letter was written in 1857 when the Slagles had just sold it to Court Harwick. The letter writer, whoever they were, had been intimately familiar with the room and its history, and they'd been associated with the property at or just before the time of the sale. George had no desire to start a county-wide controversy over a history that couldn't be undone. Neither did Eleanor, who'd lived alongside whatever that history was for 31 years and made her own peace with silence. Neither, honestly, did Nora, who understood instinctively that what was in that room wasn't a crime, but an act of conscience, and that whatever came next needed handling with care. What forced the matter wasn't moral obligation or legal compulsion. It was the second room. Because in the 3 days between George's first descent and the formal report to the sheriff, George had gone back down. He'd examined the walls of the chamber more thoroughly. He'd spent an afternoon with the lantern, working his hands along every inch of the timbered shoring, and he'd found the second room. It wasn't obvious. That needs to be said plainly. Whoever built it hadn't wanted it to be obvious, and they'd done their work well. The join was invisible to the eye. The timber shoring of the east wall looked, to any ordinary inspection, solid and continuous. The wedges driven into the gaps between the timbers were uniform and convincing. What gave it away, what George found after 2 hours of careful searching, was a thermal anomaly. He noticed it with his hand, not his eyes. Working along the east wall with his palm flat against the timber, he found a section roughly 4 feet wide and 5 feet high where the temperature of the wood was noticeably different from the sections on either side. Cooler. Not dramatically, not cold exactly, but enough, when his attention was specifically on temperature rather than visual cues, to register as wrong. Cold enters a structure from outside. The east wall of the lower chamber was built against solid stone ridge. There was no exterior exposure, no window, no obvious source of outside air. And yet the center of that wall was cooler than the sections beside it. George took out his blade and worked it along the bottom edge of that 4-foot section, just like he'd done with the floor panel above. He found the same thing. A manufactured joint fitted so tightly it was barely visible. Then he worked up the sides and across the top. The panel was about 4 feet wide and 5 feet high, hinged at the top so it swung inward rather than outward when released. He found the release mechanism, a recessed pin on the left side, and pressed it. The panel swung inward silently on well-maintained hinges. Behind it was a second passage, not a room this time, a tunnel, low and narrow, maybe 4.5 feet high and just over 2 feet wide, shored with smaller timbers and fitted stones, running east, then curving slightly north, disappearing from the lantern's range after about 15 feet. George stood at the entrance for a very long time. The draft he'd noticed on his first descent, that slight movement of air in the main chamber, was stronger here. It came from the tunnel. The tunnel connected to outside air somewhere. The temperature difference he'd felt in the east wall was the outside cold coming through the tunnel and conducting through the timber shoring. He went in. The tunnel ran about 40 feet before opening into a third space, smaller than the first chamber, roughly 6 feet by 6 feet, with a timber ceiling just high enough to stand in if you weren't too tall. It was bare of furniture, bare of equipment, bare of almost everything. The floor was earth, the walls were stone and timber. Almost everything. On the floor of that small room in the center of the earth was a pile of objects George couldn't initially process as a coherent scene. It was only after he'd crouched over them with the lantern and spent several minutes looking that he understood what he was seeing. There were shoes. A pair of small shoes, child's shoes, leather, the soles worn thin, the uppers cracked and stiff with age. Beside them, a small piece of cloth folded. George opened it. It was a child's nightcap, the kind of small cotton cap an infant or toddler might wear to sleep, its fabric the color of old ivory. And under the cloth, on the bare earth floor, was a small wooden cross, not more than 8 inches long, fashioned from 2 sticks of roughly equal thickness, bound together with a length of twine. The twine had been tied with a particular kind of care. It wasn't functional tying. The cross would have held together without it. It had been tied the way you tie something when you're taking your time, when the act of tying is itself a form of meaning. George sat in that second room, 40 feet from the main chamber, 100 feet from the house above, in the heart of a Kentucky ridge, and held the lantern over those objects for a long time. Then he put them back exactly as he'd found them. He marked the position of each with small stones before moving them so he could replace them precisely. He didn't know why this seemed important. It just did. And then he went back through the tunnel, back into the main chamber, back up the stone stairs, and told his wife and her mother what he'd found. Sheriff Aldous Crane of Harlan County was 54 years old, a native of the county, a man who'd served as sheriff for 11 years and who had, in the course of those 11 years, developed a philosophy about complexity that he expressed when pressed in these terms: some things are over, and the best thing you can do with them is understand them properly before you put them down. He came to the Harwick house on a Thursday morning in late March, accompanied by his deputy, a young man named Frederick Patton, who was 23 and had been deputized 6 months earlier. Crane came, saw the panel, descended the stairs, walked the tunnel to the second room, and spent maybe 40 minutes in the 2 underground spaces before coming back up. He sat in Eleanor Harwick's kitchen and drank the coffee she put in front of him, not speaking for several minutes. Then he asked Eleanor 3 questions. The first, did your husband tell you anything about this room before he died? Eleanor said, no, not directly. The second, did you have any indication while you were living in this house that the room was in use? Eleanor said, once. In the autumn of 1860, I heard something I believed was below the dining room floor. At night. I thought it was an animal. She paused. I did not investigate. The third, is there anyone living in this county who you believe has knowledge of how this room was used? Eleanor looked at him steadily. I have my suspicions, she said, but I would not say without being certain. Crane nodded. He looked at George. The documents in the box. You've read them all? Yes, George said. And I'd like to give them to you intact. Good. Crane wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. I'm going to need to look into the history of this property more carefully. The previous owners, the Slagles. He paused. I know the family. I know Clarence. The name sat in the room for a moment without comment. Frederick, Crane said to his deputy, I want you to go through the county deed records this week. Everything related to this property from the time it was built. Sales, surveys, anything else. He looked at George. And I want you to leave that room exactly as it is. Don't take anything. Don't move anything. Whatever is down there, it's part of a history that I intend to record properly. George nodded. Crane finished his coffee. He stood, put on his hat, and walked to the door. He paused there and turned back. Mrs. Harwick, he said. You've lived in this house for 31 years. I have, Eleanor said. And you never knew. I suspected, she said. But I never knew. Crane was quiet for a moment. There's a difference, he said. Sometimes a significant one. And then he left. Clarence Slagle was, by any observable measure, a success. His father, Rufus, had been a farmer of middling means, comfortable, not wealthy, respected in the county in the way men who attend church and pay their debts tend to be respected, without any particular distinction. Clarence had far exceeded his father's station. He'd studied law in Barberville, returned to Harlan County in his 20s, built a practice, married well. His wife was a woman named Hattie, whose father owned substantial acreage on Clover Fork, and over the following decades he'd become a figure of genuine local significance. He'd served on the county court. He'd been involved in organizing the Methodist congregation's new building fund. He contributed to the Loyal Union Academy, the small subscription school serving the Loyal area. When strangers passed through and asked who the leading men of the county were, his name came up. He was well-dressed, well-spoken, and completely in command of himself in public. He had, in the language of the era, the quality of a man who decided exactly who he wished to be and had executed that decision without apparent difficulty. Sheriff Crane called on him on the last Tuesday of March, 9 days after the initial report. He went alone, without Frederick Patton, which wasn't standard procedure for a formal interview, but which Crane had decided was appropriate given the nature of what was being discussed. He drove his buggy to the Slagle property, a handsome place on the south side of Harlan town with a well-kept yard and a painted fence. Hattie Slagle met him at the door and showed him to the parlor, where Clarence was reading. The two men had known each other for over a decade. They weren't close friends, their social circles didn't precisely overlap, but they were acquainted in the way public men in small counties inevitably become acquainted, with a mutual familiarity founded on professional respect and careful distance. Crane sat in the offered chair and didn't make any small talk. He told Clarence about the discovery at the Harwick house. He described the chamber, the tunnel, the second room. He mentioned the documents in the box. He watched Clarence's face throughout. Clarence's face was exceptional in its control. It showed, in sequence, the expressions a guilty man with years of practice would produce when hearing news he might have half expected but hoped never to face. First, a look of careful surprise, precisely modulated, not so theatrical as to seem performed, not so minimal as to seem withheld. Then a look of thoughtful gravity appropriate to the weight of what was being described. Then a slight forward lean, the posture of engagement, of a man following a story with interest rather than fear. It was a very good performance. Crane, who'd watched many people perform in his professional capacity, thought it was among the better ones he'd encountered. He let Clarence finish the performance. Then he said, "The letter in the box mentions that the room was built in 1847 by a man whose name is not given. Your family owned this property from 1841 to 1856. Your father was Rufus Slagle. Did your father ever speak to you about this room?" Clarence's expression settled into one of sincere regret. "I never knew about any room," he said. "My father died when I was 22. Whatever he may have done on that property, he never discussed it with me." "Is that so?" Crane said. "It wasn't a question. I can't speak to what my father did or didn't do before I was of age to understand such things," Clarence said. "If you're asking whether I have any personal knowledge of that room or its construction, the honest answer is no." Crane looked at him for a moment. "What about after? After you came of age, after your father's death?" A pause. Very brief, very controlled. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Crane said, "that your father died in 1867. The property had been sold to Court Harwick in 1856, but there was a gap of 11 years between your father's death and today. 11 years during which you were a grown man in this county. Familiar with the property's history, and during which, based on what Mrs. Harwick told me, the room may have been in use at least once." He leaned forward slightly. "A man who knew a room like that existed might have a reason to want to know if it was still available, even after the property changed hands." Another pause. This one slightly longer. "I have nothing to add to what I've already told you," Clarence said. His voice was level, his eyes steady. He'd made a decision about exactly how far this conversation would go. Crane recognized the decision. He nodded, stood, thanked Clarence for his time, and drove back to his office in Loyal. That evening, he wrote in his official log, "Called on C. Slagle regarding HR discovery. Slagle denies knowledge of room or its construction. Denies any involvement after death of Father R.S. in 1867. Credibility of denial uncertain. No documentary evidence to the contrary at present. Matter requires further inquiry." He underlined the last sentence. The further inquiry came from an unexpected direction. Walter Harwick, Eleanor's oldest son, living in Bell County, arrived in Harlan County 10 days after the initial discovery. He'd received a letter from Nora describing what had been found, and he'd come in the way the eldest child of aging parents comes when something significant happens, dutiful and slightly delayed, full of practical concern, vaguely guilty about the distance between Bell County and Harlan County, carrying the weight of family obligations imperfectly fulfilled. He was 43, heavier than he'd been, with the careful manner of a man who'd spent 20 years running a mill and had learned to be precise in everything because imprecision in a mill costs fingers. He wasn't an imaginative person. He didn't traffic in mystery or speculation. He preferred documentation. He'd brought from his home in Bell County something he hadn't mentioned in any correspondence. It was his father's journal. Not the aid memoir from the box under the floor, that was a record kept by whoever had been using the room before the Harwicks arrived. This was a different document, a personal journal Cord Harwick had kept for much of his life, which Walter had found among his father's effects after Cord's death in 1881, and which he'd kept without reading, on the instinct, or maybe the fear, that it contained things he wasn't prepared to know. He'd read it finally on the journey from Bell County to Harlan County, in the back of a hired wagon over 2 days of rough mountain road. He gave it to Sheriff Crane on the morning of his arrival. Crane read it in his office over the next day and a half. The journal covered roughly 25 years, from the mid-1850s through the late 1870s. Cord Harwick hadn't been a literary man. His entries were terse and factual, more account book than confession, recording weather, transactions, farm yields, occasional observations on local events. But running through that practical record, surfacing at intervals like a current under still water, was something else. Cord Harwick had known about the room from the day he bought the house. Not because Rufus Slagle had told him during the sale. Cord's journal made clear no such conversation had taken place, that the discovery was Cord's own, made within the first week of occupancy when he found the floor panel during a repair to the dining room. But he'd understood immediately what the room was. He'd gone down, seen the sleeping platform, the stove, the tunnel, and he'd made a decision. He'd left everything exactly as it was. The journal recorded, in its oblique and careful shorthand, for additional uses of the room after the Harwicks took occupancy. 4 times between 1857 and 1863, Cord Harwick had opened the panel in his dining room floor and allowed people to descend into the chamber under it. He'd brought food down in the evenings. He'd kept the stove going in winter. He'd stayed awake nights listening, aware that what he was doing, if discovered, could cost him everything. He hadn't recorded names. Not once in 4 entries did he write the name of anyone who'd sheltered in his house. The entries were brief to the point of fragmentation. Room occupied. 3 days. Departed north. Cold weather. Roof repaired. Friday. The deliberateness of the omissions was itself a form of documentation, evidence of a man who understood exactly what risk he was managing. The final entry related to the room was dated November 1863. It was the longest of the 4, and unlike the others, it included something that came close to an emotional record. Last time. I think. The road is changed and I do not know the new contacts. Rufus's boy came to see me last autumn about a matter he would not state plainly, and I told him plainly that I did not know what he was speaking of, and he went away. I believe he was fishing. I will not be fished. What is in this house is in this house, and it is mine to decide what becomes of it. I have thought sometimes about writing down what I know, the full account, every name I can remember, every direction I gave, every night I spent listening. But I have thought better of it every time. Those people do not need their history written in a document that can be found. They carried their own histories. They took them north with them where they belong. I will say this only. The room served. It served 11 people over 6 years, of which 2 I knew had arrived safely where they meant to go, and the rest I could only pray for. 11 people. That is a number I will carry to my death. The room is still there. I do not know what I will do with it in the end. Some things are meant to remain. Crane set the journal on his desk and sat with it for a long time. Then he went to find Walter Harwick. Rufus's boy came to see me last autumn about a matter he would not state plainly. That line from Cord Harwick's journal became the axis around which the investigation turned. Crane had already noted in his visit to Clarence Slagle what he described as credibility of denial uncertain. He had a man who'd come to the Harwick property, maybe in 1862 or 1863 based on Cord's timeline, asking about something he wouldn't state plainly. A man who'd grown up on that same property, whose father had owned it during the period when the room was first built. A man who, when asked directly, claimed to have no knowledge of the room's existence. If Clarence had visited Cord Harwick in 1862 or 1863, which would have made Clarence about 37 or 38 at the time, and if his purpose was what Cord's terse dismissal suggested, then the question was why. By 1862, the Civil War was in its 2nd year. The question of slavery, which had been a matter of political and moral argument for decades, was now also a matter of artillery fire and military mobilization. Harlan County, like much of the Mountain South, was deeply divided, not along the neat geographic lines later memory would assign to the conflict, but within communities and sometimes within families. Some men from the county had gone south to join Confederate forces. Others had joined the Union. Many had done neither, attempting to maintain a neutrality the war made increasingly impossible. The room under the Harwick dining room had been built to serve people moving north. The question of whether it had continued serving that purpose after 1861, and if so, under what circumstances, was both morally and legally complex in ways the pre-war situation hadn't been. What had Clarence Slagle wanted from Court Harwick in the autumn of that wartime year? Crane thought about this for a long time before deciding on an approach. He went back to Clarence Slagle. This time he brought Frederick Patton. He brought the excerpt from Cord's journal he'd copied out by hand, not the original, which he'd secured as evidence, but a precise transcription. He sat in Clarence's parlor in the same chair as before and read the excerpt aloud. Clarence listened without expression. The journal identifies you as the person who visited Court Harwick in the autumn of 1862 or 1863 and inquired about a matter you would not state plainly, Crane said. Court Harwick believed you were asking about the room. He told you he did not know what you were speaking of. Clarence said, I have no recollection of any such visit. Crane said carefully, do you have no recollection? Or are you telling me it didn't happen? A silence. Those are different things, Crane said. Clarence Slagle looked at the sheriff of Harlan County for a long moment. He was 61 years old, a man of substance and standing, a man who'd spent his entire adult life building a reputation he had reason to value. He had a wife, grown children, a practice, a name that meant something in this county. He also, Crane suspected, had a history. Not a criminal one precisely, not one that would hold up in any court of 1887, but a personal history, a history of choices made and silences kept, that was quite a bit more complicated than the public man in the parlor would have wished. What is it you want from me? Clarence said. His voice was still level, still controlled, but the performance had dropped away. He was simply asking a direct question. The truth, Crane said. As much of it as you know. Not for the purpose of prosecution. There's nothing to prosecute. The war's been over for 20 years, and the law has changed in every direction that matters. I want the truth because there is a history in those two rooms that deserves to be understood completely. And you are one of the few people still living who might actually be able to provide the pieces I don't have. Clarence looked out the window. A long silence. His hands folded on his knee did not move. My father built that room, he said. I was 14 years old. I helped carry the timber down. I thought we were building a second cellar for dry storage. He paused. He told me the truth 3 years later. I was 17. He took me down and explained what the room was and what it had been used for and why. He paused again. My father was a complicated man. He was in many ways a man of his time, which is to say that there were things he accepted without question that I now know were wrong. But the room was a thing he had done with his full conscience, and he was not ashamed of it. Did he ever tell you how many people had used it? Crane asked. He said 17 over 7 years, but he said that number carefully. He was uncertain about several of them. 17, the same number in the letter in the box. And when you went to see Court Harwick, Crane said. Clarence was quiet for a moment. My father had died the year before. 1861, I had known when the house was sold to Harwick in 56 that the room was still there. I didn't know Harwick's sympathies. In 62, when the war had been running for a year and the situation in the mountains was complicated, I wanted to know if the room was still being used. Not to stop it. I wanted to know if it was still being used because I had information about routes, about contacts, that might be useful to anyone using it. He stopped. Harwick didn't trust me. I can't say I blame him. I was Slagle's son and I was a lawyer, and there was no reason on earth for him to take my word for anything. He told me he didn't know what I was talking about and showed me the door. And after that, nothing. The war ended. Everything changed. He looked back at Crane. There was a child, he said. Crane was still. In the second room, Clarence said. The one at the end of the tunnel. In 1849, when I was 23, a woman and a child. The child was very young, 2 years old perhaps. The woman had carried the child the whole way from Carter County, Virginia, almost 90 miles. She arrived at our property in the middle of a cold October night. He stopped. The child died, he said. 3 days into the stay. The cold and the exhaustion of the journey. The woman, I don't know her name. My father never told me her name. She stayed for another 2 days and then she went north. My father buried the child in the second room. He didn't mark it above ground because he couldn't risk anyone finding it and asking questions. He put a cross and the child's things down there, and he pressed the earth over them, and that was the burial. George Pruitt, in his second descent to the small room at the end of the tunnel, had found shoes, a nightcap, a cross bound with twine. He put them back exactly as he found them. Do you know if the woman survived? Crane asked. No, Clarence said. My father never found out. He looked for years. He never found out. The letter in the box, to whoever uses this place after me, had been dated April 14, 1857. The Slagles had sold the property to Cord Harwick in the spring of 1856. The letter had been written a year after the property changed hands, which meant it hadn't been written by Rufus Slagle. He'd already sold the house. He wouldn't have had access to the room after the sale. Crane had noted this discrepancy from the beginning but had held it in reserve, waiting for the investigation to produce a candidate. When he read the letter again after his second conversation with Clarence, he noticed something he hadn't noticed before, or rather had noticed but not yet processed. The handwriting. He had in his possession at this point 3 documents in the same hand. The journal from the box, the aid memoir of routes and initials and compass directions. The fragment of a letter beginning, and if you find yourself unable to proceed before the weather turns. And the complete letter addressed to whoever uses this place after me. The same person had written all 3, and that person hadn't been Rufus Slagle, because Crane had found a deed signed by Rufus Slagle in the county records, and the handwriting didn't match. The handwriting was that of an educated person. The language was that of an educated person. May God grant mercy to everyone who has ever sheltered in this darkness and to everyone who made the choice to keep the light on for them. That wasn't the language of a farmer. It was the language of someone trained in careful expression. Crane asked Clarence Slagle if his father had ever had an associate, a partner, a confidant, anyone who had knowledge of the room and was closely connected to the property. Clarence thought for a long time. Then, there was a man. A minister. He served the area around Loyal from about 1845 to maybe 1858. His name was Alden Price. Welsh family from somewhere in Western Virginia originally. He was educated, studied theology somewhere, I believe, though he was never ordained in any formal denomination. He called himself simply a minister. Clarence paused. He was a friend of my father's. He visited the property many times. He knew about the room. Crane found the handwriting of Alden Price in the archives of the Methodist congregation at Loyal. The minutes of several meetings written in the minister's hand during his tenure. The handwriting matched the documents from the box precisely. Alden Price had kept the record of the room's uses. Alden Price had written the letter. Alden Price had been the person who knew the routes, who knew the contacts, who had managed the practical realities of what Rufus Slagle had built and others had used. And Alden Price had left the county in 1857, and according to every record Crane could find, had not returned. The aid memoir from the box, that small leather-bound journal of routes and initials, turned out to be more readable than it had first appeared. It needed a key, which Crane eventually worked out with Walter Harwick's help over several evenings, and once deciphered, it produced a meticulous record. 17 people over 7 years, from 1847 to 1854. The entries were brief, a date, a pair or set of initials, a direction of travel, and occasionally a note, arrived well or continued or 2 days. And in 3 cases, a small mark that Crane and Walter agreed after long consideration almost certainly indicated uncertainty about the outcome. 17 people. Men and women. And in at least 2 cases, one of them being the child whose cross still lay in the earth of the second room, children. From Virginia, most of them, based on the directional notations. Moving north toward the river crossings in central and northern Kentucky, and from there toward Ohio, toward Indiana, toward whatever form of continued life they could build beyond the reach of the laws that had claimed ownership of them. Crane couldn't identify any of the 17 from the initials alone. There was no cross-reference, no additional documentation, no way to know which of the 17, if any, had arrived where they were going. He wrote to contacts in several Ohio and Indiana counties, describing what he'd found, and asking if any local record showed persons of this approximate timing and origin who had settled in those areas. Over the following months, he received 2 responses of cautious interest, one from a clerk in Athens County, Ohio, one from a minister in Shelby County, Indiana. But neither could be definitively connected to the Harlan County room. The 9 safe arrivals the letter mentioned, "I have confirmed 9 safe arrivals," remained unconfirmable. What could be confirmed, and what Crane documented with considerable care, was the physical record. The room, the tunnel, the second room, the sleeping platform, the stove and its concealed ventilation, the wooden box and its contents, the cross in the earth. He wrote it all down in the official log of Harlan County, in the clear and methodical prose of a man who understood that the record itself was a form of obligation. The deposition he took from Eleanor Harwick, her formal statement about what she'd suspected and when, and the distinction she made between suspecting and knowing, was written into the same record. The deposition from Clarence Slagle, who came to the office voluntarily and dictated a full account of what his father had told him and what he himself knew. The transcriptions from Cord Harwick's journal. The authenticated handwriting comparison establishing Alden Price as the author of the documents in the box. It was the most complete account anyone could produce 30 years after the fact of a small informal station in the mountain routes of the pre-war South. It didn't account for everything. It couldn't name the 17. It couldn't confirm the 9. It couldn't find Alden Price or determine where he'd gone in 1857 or what had happened to him afterward. But it established what had happened in that house. And it established, and this was the detail Crane returned to more than any other in the years after he closed the formal investigation, that it had been done in silence. Not in organization. Not with official sanction. Not with recognition. In silence. In the cold. In the dark. By ordinary people who had decided to open a door. The investigation concluded formally in August of 1887, 5 months after George Pruitt lifted the floor panel in the dining room. Crane's official record ran to 37 handwritten pages. He filed it with the county court, made a copy for his own archive, and provided Eleanor Harwick with a summary. Eleanor read the summary at the kitchen table with Nora beside her on a warm afternoon in late August, with the windows open and the sound of the creek audible from below the ridge. She read it without commenting, turning the pages carefully, her face controlled in the way it always was. When she finished, she folded it neatly and set it on the table. 31 years, she said. And I ate my meals above that room for 31 years. Nora looked at her. Does that disturb you? Eleanor thought about it. A real consideration, not a deflection. No, she said finally. It does not disturb me. What disturbs me is that I didn't know. What disturbs me is that Cord couldn't tell me. She paused. He didn't tell me because he didn't trust that I would understand what it meant. Or perhaps because he thought the knowing would be a burden for me. Either way, he carried it alone for 30 years, and now he is dead. And the people in those rooms are gone. And the only one left to account for any of it is an old woman who didn't know. You suspected, Nora said. Suspecting is not knowing, Eleanor said. She was quiet for a long moment. The child in the second room, she said. The child buried in the earth at the end of that tunnel. That child has been under my house for 40 years. Neither of them spoke. I want a proper burial, Eleanor said. Whatever can be done, I want that child given a proper burial. She looked at Nora. Will George arrange it? Yes, Nora said. He will. George Pruitt, in consultation with the Methodist minister in Loyal and with the agreement of Sheriff Crane, arranged a small private ceremony in the family burial plot at the edge of the Harwick property. The remains, fragmentary after 40 years in the earth, were moved with care and rain-terred with a marker. The marker didn't bear a name because no name was known. It bore only a date, approximately 1849, and a small cross, echoing the one that had been found in the second room. Eleanor attended. Nora and George attended. Sheriff Crane attended. Clarence Slagle, who'd learned of the arrangement through Crane, attended as well, standing apart at a slight distance, his hat in his hands, saying nothing. It was a quiet ceremony, as it had to be. The congregation was small, and the grave was small, and the day was overcast, the kind of Kentucky late summer day that carries in it the first cold breath of the coming autumn. The minister said what ministers say when they bury the unknown. A prayer for the soul, a prayer for peace, a hope that the journey home was short. Eleanor stood at the grave for a long time after the others had moved back. Then she went inside and made supper, and the ridge above Martin's Fork Creek was quiet as the evening came on. Eleanor Harwick continued to live in the house on the ridge for 4 more years, until her death in the spring of 1891 at the age of 76. She died in her own bed in the room she'd shared with Cord Harwick for decades, with Nora beside her. The panel in the dining room floor had been left intact. George had resealed it after the investigation, precisely as it had been. The pin latch, the hinges, the invisible join. It could be opened. It still could be opened. But Eleanor had made clear she didn't want it altered or covered or removed. It was built for a purpose, she said to Nora in one of the conversations they had in the months after the investigation ended. It served that purpose. It should stay as it is. She ate her meals above it for 4 more years, now knowing what it was, now knowing the names. Not of the 17 who had sheltered there, but of the men who had built and maintained it, the minister who'd kept its record, the woman who'd arrived in October with a child too small to survive the journey. She ate her meals above all of it, and the knowing, she said, changed things. Not in the dramatic way secrets revealed in stories tend to change things, not as revelation or rupture, but in the quiet way truth changes the texture of ordinary life. The same table, the same chairs, the same creak sound from below the ridge. But underneath, a room, a record, a small grave at the edge of the property. I think about them, she told Nora once. Not at particular times. Just I think about them. The way you think about people you never met but whose existence has touched yours. I think about the woman who left her child in that earth and went north. I wonder if she made it. I wonder if she thought about that room for the rest of her life. She was quiet for a moment. I think she did, she said. I think some rooms stay with you forever. When Nora Pruitt inherited the property after Eleanor's death in 1891, she and George debated what to do with it. The house was old and would need significant maintenance. The farm hadn't been actively worked for years. They had their own property 6 miles away. But neither of them could bring themselves to sell it. They rented it instead to a family named Hensley, who lived in it for 12 years without ever learning about the panel in the dining room floor. George had sealed it thoroughly before the Hensleys moved in and had placed a heavy sideboard over the section, not to hide it exactly, but to give it protection. When the Hensley family left in 1903, Nora had the panel opened and inspected. Everything below was as it had been. The sleeping platform, the iron stove, the box now emptied of the documents which were in Crane's archive. The wool blankets still folded on their hook, 20 years older and more fragile. The tunnel to the second room with the small cross still in the earth where George had replaced it. She sealed it again. She placed a new marker at the grave in the family plot, replacing the original stone that had weathered. Sheriff Aldous Crane died in 1899 after serving as Harlan County Sheriff for 23 years. The record he compiled, 37 handwritten pages with the full accounts, the depositions, the handwriting comparisons, passed into the county court archive where it remained. His deputy, Frederick Patton, who by 1899 had become the county clerk, ensured the record was preserved and properly filed. Walter Harwick, who'd brought his father's journal from Bell County and had participated in the investigation, wrote his own account of the discovery in 1895, a decade after the fact. It wasn't published. He wrote it for himself, he said, and for his children, who were by then grown and had asked him about the room their grandmother had told them about in her final years. The account ran to 40 pages, written in the careful, precise hand of a mill operator who understood the value of accurate records. Walter's account included a detail none of the official documents had captured, his own recollection of a conversation with his father, Cord Harwick, in the late summer of 1878, 3 years before Cord's death. Walter had been 34. He'd come to visit his parents and spent several days at the house. One evening, sitting on the porch after supper with his father while Eleanor was inside, Cord had said something Walter hadn't fully understood at the time. "I built a good house," Cord had said. "It was good before I got here. I kept it good. That's all any man can do." Walter hadn't known then what his father meant. He'd thought Cord was talking about carpentry or farming or the ordinary kind of pride a man takes in a property well maintained. He knew what it meant now. "It was good before I got here. I kept it good." 11 people had descended those stairs under Cord Harwick's care and gone north. Of the 2 whose arrivals he'd confirmed, one, Walter had learned this from a contact in central Ohio after years of quiet searching, had been a man named Charles, surname unknown, who'd worked as a blacksmith in a small town in Greene County, Ohio, for the remainder of his life. He died in 1879, 8 years before the floor panel was discovered, married with 4 children. His death notice in the local paper described him as a man of great dignity and good humor, much beloved by those who knew him. That was all Walter had found. One name, partial. One life, partial. Out of 11. "I do not know what happened to the other 10, he wrote. "I believe my father did not know either. The uncertainty seemed to be something he accepted. Not peacefully exactly, but with the recognition that some things cannot be resolved. He helped. He kept the secret. He did not know for most of his life whether the helping had mattered. He kept it good anyway. I think that is the only kind of courage that actually exists. Not the kind where you know the outcome. The kind where you don't." The Harwick property passed out of the family's possession in 1911 when George Pruitt, in his early 60s and in declining health, made the decision to sell. By that time, the railroad had arrived in Harlan County and the coal companies with it, and the county had changed in ways none of the people who'd lived through the discovery of 1887 could entirely have anticipated. The mountains were being opened, the valleys were being filled. A world defined by isolation and self-sufficiency was giving way to something noisier and more connected and more brutal. The buyer was a mining company's representative who purchased the Ridge property along with several adjacent parcels as part of a larger land acquisition. The house was eventually demolished to make way for a service road. The outbuildings went with it. The root cellar in the hillside was collapsed and filled. The family burial plot was not disturbed. The graves, Cord Harwick, Eleanor Harwick, and the small unmarked grave with its replacement stone, were situated at the edge of the property's original boundary and weren't included in the mining company's operational area. A fence was put around them. The fence stood for many years and then did not. The panel in the dining room floor went with the house when the house came down. The chamber below, dug into the stone of the ridge, may still be there, under whatever surface now covers that ground, under the weight of a century and more of accumulated time. The tunnel that runs east from the chamber, 40 feet through the mountain, ending in the small room where a child was buried in the autumn of 1849. These things don't disappear just because the structures above them are removed. The record in the Harlan County Court Archive survived. Frederick Patton had ensured it was properly preserved, and when the county reorganized its records in the early 1900s, the file was retained. Aldous Crane's 37 handwritten pages, the transcriptions from Cord Harwick's journal, the depositions from Eleanor Harwick and Clarence Slagle, the handwriting comparison for Alden Price. And in the county archive of Bell County, among the personal papers donated by the Harwick family in 1924, a year after Walter Harwick's death, the 40-page account Walter had written in 1895, in the careful hand of a mill operator who knew the value of accurate records. Alden Price was never found. Whatever had taken him away from Harlan County in 1857, and wherever he'd gone, he hadn't left a trail anyone in the years before or after the investigation had been able to follow. The routes he'd mapped in his small leather journal ran through mountains now themselves changed almost beyond recognition. The creek's still there, but the paths altered, the farms replaced by mining operations and logging roads, and eventually by the slow encroachment of vegetation over abandoned ground. The woman who'd carried her child 90 miles through those mountains in October 1849 remained unnamed. She'd passed through the room and gone north and vanished into whatever life she'd made or failed to make beyond the reach of documentation. Her child was buried in Kentucky. She was somewhere else. 17 people. 9 confirmed safe arrivals. 1 partial name recovered decades later in a death notice in an Ohio county paper, a man of great dignity and good humor, much beloved by those who knew him. And under a dining room floor, hidden for 31 years from the woman who ate her meals above it, a staircase of cut stone descending into the dark. Built not for secrecy's own sake, but for the oldest reason human beings build hidden things, because there were people who needed to be hidden, and someone chose to build. The floor panel was lifted in the spring of 1887. The stone stairs went down 11 steps to a low-ceilinged room of timber and earth. The room was clean. The stove was cold. The blankets were still folded on their hook. The tunnel ran east 40 feet through the mountain. At the end of the tunnel, in the earth of a small room no one had entered in 30 years, a cross was bound with twine. Someone had tied it carefully. If this story touched you, if it made you feel something, please take a moment to share it. These are the stories that need to be remembered. And before you go, don't forget to like and subscribe to the Fear Sermon, so you never miss another tale from the shadows of history. Leave a comment below and let me know, what would you have done if you'd lifted the floorboard? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.